Prime Minister's anti-corruption champion, chair of the Conservative Policy Forum and former tourism minister. Rachael Maskell is a Labour MP for York, or the Labour MP for York Central, I should say. Olivia Utley is assistant comment editor at The Telegraph, and Pete Wishart is SNP for Perth and North Perthshire, who's the party's shadow leader of the House. They're here to take your calls, 0345 6060 973, and of course you can watch us on Global Player.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Before we start, I should explain that if you ever miss an edition of Cross Question, you can catch up on the Cross Question podcast, or you can catch up on Global Player, and you can watch it on the LBC YouTube channel as well. We try and cater for everyone. A lot of people do, actually. Right, let's go to our first caller. It's Martin in Doncaster. Hello, Martin.
Hi, Iain and panel. Yeah, the question is why are not more Tory MPs coming out for Boris Johnson today?
Coming out for him, or...
Yeah.
Supporting him, you mean?
Supporting him, yeah, today.
OK. Well, let's see if John Penrose is going to support him.
So I think, in fact, there's an awful lot of pretty angry and frustrated people, not just in my party, but in other parties too. And I'll let Pete and Rachael speak for the other parties, of course. But the difficulty which I think everyone had today was that the Sue-Gray report, which everyone's been waiting for, I've been telling my constituents, we'll wait for the Sue-Gray report, it'll give us all the facts. And it gives us a lot of the facts. But actually, the difficulty with it is that it didn't show the Prime Minister as having attended a lot more events and sort of been fined for them than we already knew. There was nothing sort of new on that respect. But it doesn't mean to say that he's kind of, all is forgiven and he's got off scot-free, because it also says there's some really serious problems with leadership. And he's part of the leadership. He's the leader of the leaders, as it were, although there's the civil servants too. And so... there's a lot of people who are really worried that that those questions, those criticisms of his leadership, go to his integrity, will keep questions about his trustability, his honesty, keep them bubbling away, and that's the thing which I think we've all got to grapple with. And I think it's not just Conservative MPs who've got to grapple with this. Actually, voters need to make up their minds about this as well, and I think some of them have. And so that's the reason why. There are an awful lot of people who are looking at it and going, this doesn't really put the thing to bed, and we were expecting it would, and it doesn't end it. It doesn't crystallise it one way or another, and that's why a lot of people in my party, at least, are both angry and frustrated.
And you sound as if you're one of them. That wasn't exactly the biggest re-endorsement I've ever heard a Tory MP give to his party leader.
I really, really wanted to be able to sit here and say, he's either got off scot-free or whatever. But I'm sorry. I'm very sorry to say I don't think that is the case at the moment. Now he can still change that round. He can still show that he's learned. He said he understands the criticisms of what's been going on, the sort of the culture in Number 10. And if he shows not tells, and we can see that that's different over the course of the next couple of months.
Has he not? I mean, he would argue that he's already done that by making lots of different appointments, getting rid of quite a few people in Number 10. Has that not made a difference?
I think that's made an important start. Yes, absolutely. And I think it would be wrong and churlish for any of us to ignore that. So I think he's made a really important start there, yeah. But it needs to carry on.
He addressed the 1922 committee this evening. Were you there?
I was.
The previous time this happened, I think when the first version of Sue-Gray's report came out, I'm told that he essentially tried to pretend that he'd done nothing wrong. This time, I suspect it was rather different.
Yes, it was. I mean, in theory, at least the 1922 committee is sort of, we're all sworn to
right, no one's listening.
But I think I can at least share this, which is he spent, it was a very downbeat Boris. He was very contrite and said, look, I accept that I need to do better. But he also said, he was horrified by a whole collection of other things. For example, Sue-Gray is very critical of the treatment of some of the staff in Number 10. In fact, I think, Iain, you've written about this recently. So I think it was, he was making all the right noises, but we've got to see action, and we've got to see it continuing, not just warm words.
Had you sent a letter to Sir Graham Brady?
And forgive me, I'm still thinking about that. So I'm going to sleep on that. But it's because it hasn't put the issue to bed one way or another.
What more do you need to know?
Well, so before this came in, I had in my mind something called I was quietly calling the Matt Hancock test. And the Matt Hancock...
Good God.
No, but it turns out not to be right. But the idea was that since we had already bid farewell to Professor Ferguson, who broke the rules and got sacked, and then we bid farewell to Matt Hancock, who, not just once accidentally, but lots of times, there was a pattern of behaviour there and got sacked. If the Prime Minister had sort of, personally, breached that same standard, then by all that's right, the same thing should apply.
Well, he has, hasn't he?
No, I don't think he has. He got fined for one event, but it's not a pattern of behaviour, and it was serious. I'm not saying it's not. I think he's the first.
Well, he was fined, which is more than Ferguson or Hancock were.
Yeah, indeed. But it was.
So therefore, it's more serious.
On one event, it probably is, but as a pattern of behaviour, because what we're talking about here is, was there a culture where the rules didn't apply to him?
There is a pattern of behaviour with Boris Johnson, isn't there? That he continually doesn't tell the truth.
Well, that's the other bit which hasn't been put to bed yet. So there is a great deal of concern about whether or not he's been telling the truth in Parliament, for example, and that's why the Privileges Committee, which is sort of this arcane body, but it's nonetheless a cross-party thing, which will have a proper investigation into whether or not he's been telling the truth in Parliament. And normally, anybody who doesn't do that, particularly a minister, if they don't do that, then they're toast. They're expected to resign sort of on the spot. That is underway at the moment, and we'll know more about it. But that's another example of something which hasn't been answered, hasn't been put to bed.
But you're not saying, well, we now have to wait for the result of that, do we? Because that cannot surely be the case.
And that's
that could be October.
It could be months, and that's one of the reasons why I'm sounding so angry and frustrated. Is that I was expecting us to be able to have a crystallised answer now, and we haven't flipping got it.
Well, I think that's the longest time I've ever given anyone on Cross Question, but I think my fellow panellists will understand why. Rachael Maskell, from where you were sitting in the Commons today, did you see a contrite, apologetic Prime Minister?
I saw a Prime Minister trying to move on from the position, and he constantly was trying to move the debate forward, but clearly the rest of the country can't move forward. The grief, the bereavement that people have had over this time today just added salt into that wound. And of course, we've seen that time and time again throughout this really sorry saga. But what I picked out of Sue Gray's report were the two words, judgment and leadership. And the Prime Minister's role is to provide both judgment and leadership, and he fell short on those issues. And I think it talked into a culture which had developed under his leadership in Number 10. The fact that staff were dismissed for the important roles that they play in cleaning the place and keeping the place secure. The fact that they believed that, the Wine Friday was an acceptable thing in any modern workplace when the rest of the country were following rules. There was a culture in that place which the Prime Minister provided leadership over, and therefore I think there are still many questions the Prime Minister has to answer about his conduct and his foresight over his behaviour, but that of his staff, but also I think recognising the real challenge that the whole country is facing at this juncture, still having a Prime Minister who isn't listening and heeding to the pain. And I think in some of the language he used today about moving on and talking about all of his great record and what he wants to achieve to do again in the future, but not pausing in that moment to hear the pain of the nation. That is what a Prime Minister with contrition would have done. He failed. Apart
from resigning, which obviously that's what Keir Starmer and many others asked him to do today, but apart from that, was there anything he could have said that would have encouraged you to come here into the studio and say, fair dues, I actually believe what he said today?
I don't think we've seen remorse coming from the Prime Minister at all, that recognition of the pain. And I think we've seen it on every junction, every question, and I've attended those, is that the Prime Minister is constantly trying to move the debate forward. It's like, I've done this, I've ticked the box, I've said the word sorry, and now we're going to move into the next thing on my agenda. Even today, he tried to achieve that. He didn't take that time to pause with the nation through their pain. And I think that shows that this is all about his survival and his future.
And of course, tomorrow we've got this big cost of living crisis announcement. We have no idea what it's going to contain, but it's sort of the ultimate dead cat, isn't it? Saying, OK, we can move on from Sue Gray now. Let's talk about cost of living.
The frenzy of announcements.
Which in some ways you would welcome, I imagine.
Well, the frenzy of announcements, we will start seeing the hyperactivity of the Prime Minister bouncing around the world, no doubt. But the reality is he hasn't learned, because that is the behaviour he's displayed on so many occasions.
Olivia Utley, how angry are Telegraph readers? I mean, because in the last hour, I was actually getting more calls than I thought I would defending Boris Johnson. Now, what are your readers saying?
Our readers are sort of very deliberately not being interested. They're sick of the whole Partygate thing.
Move along, nothing to see here.
They're not defending Boris Johnson at all. They are very fed up with him. But they're fed up less with Partygate than with the seeming sort of total vacuum at the heart of Number 10, the lack of any sort of philosophical might or real agenda driving Downing Street forward at all. They feel, and this is what we just keep hearing over and over again, that there's nothing really there. Boris Johnson's only plan is to remain as Prime Minister. And it feels a little bit as though he's sort of ricocheting from, I mean, this is me talking now, not Telegraph readers, but it feels a little bit like he's sort of ricocheting from crisis to crisis. And ricocheting between those crises, he doesn't seem to have a plan. It's sort of grab onto anything that he can to distract from whatever the story happens to be of the day. So, tomorrow he might be doing the windfall tax, which was a Labour idea to begin with, and quite a lot of Tories have some quite serious issues with it. He doesn't really seem to have a plan for growth at all. There's never any conversation about growth. There's not really talk about lowering taxes. It's all just sort of handing some sweets to whoever he happens to have spoken to recently in the hope that they'll forget about the last saga that he's got himself caught up in. So I don't think it's so much Partygate that's annoying our sort of core Tory readers, but the whole just total lack of direction at the very heart of government.
Pete Wishart, I've been looking at your tweets today and over the past few days.
Yeah.
Fairly robust, I think I would describe them as. Was there anything that he said today that surprised you?
I thought today was just unmitigated drivel that we heard from the Prime Minister. I was actually really angry at what he had to say. I found it dishonest, disingenuous, delusional, self-serving. There was no real contrition, nothing like remorse. It was all everybody else's fault, a failure to take responsibility in all this. And I was watching Conservative MPs today, to go back to Martin's original question, and they were like rabbits caught in the headlights. There was a sort of stunned silence that was emanating from the Conservative benches. There's only about, I think, 17 bothered to turn up to try and defend it. It was certainly less than 20 in a statement that lasted over an hour and a half, and I think they're seriously conflicted. My view of Conservative MPs is, like, and I'm listening to John, as I always do, listen to John very carefully, I think they're totally conflicted. They just want this gone. They just want somebody else to deal with this, to put them out their misery. They know they can't act themselves. They're all a bit sort of, with due respect, John, a little bit spineless when it comes to all this. They can finish this.
I'm here, aren't I, Pete?
I love that. With all due respect, you're spineless.
I turned up, come on.
They can finish this tomorrow. All they need to do is just say, like, the choice that Conservative MPs have got is either replace him and he goes down, or they go down with him. That's basically the choice that they've got. And I think at some point they're going to have to resolve this, fix this out, just do what's required. It's unsustainable that they could go into a general election with him as their leader. If they do, they will be pounded. I think they're down to one seat in Scotland. That's what. But you see,
a lot of Northern Tory MPs still see him as an election winner, and I mean that's going to be the key, isn't it, John? Where if many of your colleagues, I mean, you're in a relatively safe seat, I think I'm right in saying
it used not to be.
Okay,
and I don't take it for granted. I guess is the point. Yeah.
The mentality goes like this, doesn't it? If I think that Boris Johnson is more likely to help me win my seat than Liz Truss, Rishi Sunak, Penny Mordaunt, Nadine Zahawi, whoever, then you're going to stick with Nurse for fear of worse.
But I don't think the Conservative members of Parliament, certainly the ones I've spoken to, are at that stage yet. They just want it to go away. They want it passed.
You can't blame them for that, can you?
Absolutely, but they're not prepared. And I don't think they see a way forward about how to act decisively about this. They've not made up their mind who should be the natural successor, because there isn't a natural successor. And I think they're just sort of walling around just now, dealing with this crisis to crisis. And of course, you're right, tomorrow they'll try and move this on. I don't know how comfortable it's going to be, because I think we're almost all agreed and certain it's going to be a massive U-turn on a windfall tax to try and get him out of this. But this is the type of crisis management that they're going to have to deal with and confront for the next few weeks and months until they deal with this one way or the other. Either say we're all behind them and we're looking forward to him leading us to the next general election, or get rid of him. It can't go on like this.
We might have a question on this later, but my prediction for tomorrow is if they do go for a windfall tax, they'll raise double the amount that Labour is intending to raise by it, just so they can say, no, we're not copying Labour. This is much, much bigger, but we'll see if I'm right. Right, more questions in a moment on Cross Question. You're listening to LBC. It's 18 minutes past 8.
This is LBC. It all. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
20 past 8 on LBC. John Penrose, Conservative MP, Rachael, Maskell, Labour MP, Olivia Utley from the Telegraph, and Pete Wishart for the SNP are with us answering your questions. 0345 6060 973. We're going to stick with this subject for a bit, but if you have questions on maybe the cost of living, because there is this big announcement coming tomorrow, we'd love to hear those, or indeed on any other subject too. Let's go to Phil in Whitehaven. Hello, Phil. Oh, no, it's a text. Apologies, bad presenter. Does the panel think Keir Starmer is a hypocrite for not resigning himself but calling for Johnson to go? I was listening to Eddie Mayer earlier on LBC, and he was interviewing Steve Reid from Labour's Shadow Cabinet and gave him a right pummelling over this. Olivia Utley, in theory, you can make that argument, can't you? But Steve Reid's argument was, well, you can't really compare the two positions.
To be honest, I didn't think I'd be here defending Keir Starmer this evening, but actually, I think I take Steve Reid's side over this. Before today, I was sort of ready generally to move on from the whole Partygate saga. My view was that the rules were ridiculously draconian, extremely confusing and very poorly drafted and brought in far too quickly, and no one really understood them. And to an extent, there were lots of people, and I know there were lots and lots of people who didn't break them at all, but there were plenty of people who did, either knowingly or unknowingly. And I thought the whole thing had got a little bit too much, and everyone shouting at each other to resign was getting a bit ridiculous. I think what the report showed, although it didn't actually reveal very many new facts, it just added some sort of colour, and it sort of showed the level of the way this thing sort of seeped through the whole of government, and the way Boris Johnson was presiding over this totally shambolic number 10. Whereas I think what Keir Starmer did in attending this drinks, which end up having a couple of beers. I mean, it's not great, and I think he should definitely apologise. And I think if it turns out, we don't know the details, and if it turns out if he does get fined by the police, then I think he should resign. He said that he will. But I do think it's not particularly fair to compare them both. And I think if Boris Johnson had just been fined for that one party, I don't think he should have had to resign. It's the culture that he presided over that just shows that he's not a good leader, and I think that's more of the problem than the fact that he attended a party himself.
Rachael Maskell.
Well, I would agree, and I think the difference is not only has Keir Starmer said that if the police were to find that was in breach of the rules, that he would resign, but also, and the man's got to eat.
Pretty high stakes, isn't it? That decision.
I think that shows a confidence, though, that he did everything earnestly to follow the rules, but he has been very straight at the way he's approached this. I think what we found was the obfuscation of the Prime Minister by saying he wasn't at a party, he didn't know about parties, and lo and behold, until the photos emerged, he was in denial before the House and the country, and I think that's the difference we've seen. I mean, the reality is, at the end of a busy campaigning day, at work, people in their workplaces have the right to have a meal, but the police will see whether or not that constituted a party. That's the question that they've been given, but ultimately he had a meal and had a drink, and neither of those things were ruled out at that time. We're in a different time frame from most of these parties which the Prime Minister was engaged in, but at the same time the police will carry out their investigation and they will come to their judgment.
Pete Wishart.
Well, it's been a heroic attempt, hasn't it, to try and draw some sort of equivalence to what Keir Starmer did at the end of a campaign day to a culture which was seen in all its full gory details today, and there is no equivalence. And I think that this attempt to try and paint everybody the same is something which I hope fails disastrously for them, because there is no equivalence. And I put myself in this situation. How would I have responded if I was in a campaign and at the end of an evening I would be having a meal and a chat with some of the colleagues, as long as it was socially distanced and within the rules. I would never have been at a party where there's wine on the walls, where somebody is being sick.
Well, to be fair and factual, Boris Johnson wasn't at that event.
But he overseen a culture which allowed all of these things to go on and happen. He was the boss, and he has refused to take responsibility for this. I just could never see myself under any situation or circumstance to be anywhere close to that type of thing. And I back Keir entirely in all this. And I thought the comment that he made today in Prime Minister's question, where he tried to call him beer korma, how crass and ridiculous. All the serious things that were brought to the attention of the House today, the sacrifices that people up and down this country were prepared to endure in order that this country was made safe, and he was making jokes like this and trying to have some sort of ridiculous equivalence about a day at the end of a campaign to a weird culture of partying at number 10.
Paul on a text says, the best analogy I've heard is Starmer finds a pound in the street and Johnson robs a bank.
Yeah.
John Penrose, do you have any sympathy with Keir Starmer's position?
Well, I think I agree with Olivia that the where we are now is much more about the broader culture and whether or not that speaks to sort of leadership styles and that sort of stuff. But on the specifics of what the two of them got up to, the thing which just I think is annoying but not disastrous is that Keir Starmer started calling for Boris Johnson to resign when he was being investigated and before anybody knew he'd done anything wrong. All we knew was he was being investigated, and there's Keir saying, well, he's the first Prime Minister to be investigated and therefore he should resign immediately. And now Keir finds himself in precisely that same situation. So I think that is pretty embarrassing for Keir, but is it a resigning matter? No. But I do think it tells you something about the irritating Westminster bubble obsessions which turn people right off politics.
Kelvin in Boreham Wood has a question allied to this. Kelvin, would you like to go ahead? Hi.
Thank you. Does the panel think that the Sue Gray report that came out today was the original, or do you think it's been diluted?
By whom?
Good question.
Pete Wishart.
I actually think it's the real thing. I think that I think Sue Gray's been as good as her word. I think she's investigated this thoroughly and fully. I don't think she's been prepared to be sidetracked by anybody at all in all this. I was concerned when I saw the reports of the Prime Minister meeting with Sue Gray, and I was a bit uncomfortable today where he was referring to Sue as if Sue was his greatest friend in the world, as opposed to Ms. Gray, which I think would have been the appropriate way to refer to her. So I was a bit uncomfortable with all of that, but I think this is a serious and solid piece of work, and I think she went about it in exactly the right way. She probably found great resistance all the way through. You could imagine trying to get some of the details out of some of the people that are involved in all this, but I think this is the real thing. I think there's still more to come out. I mean, there's the Abergate party, that wasn't in the report. I think there's still details about that that's still to emerge. I think there are other things. I think people have a thirst to uncover exactly what's happened in the course of the past couple of years, and I think there'll be a steady drip of other details coming forward in the course of the next few weeks and months.
I think we all need to know which ABBA songs were sung at this party, because it was the night that Dominic Cummings was sent packing, I think, wasn't it? So maybe the winner takes it all would be never. Yes, also possibly.
Stop there.
Yeah, okay. Olivia. You've forgotten the question.
Sorry, I have forgotten the question.
Can the panel explain how... No. Does the panel think the Sue Gray report we saw today was the original, or was it watered down by political pressure?
No, I think it was the original. I think it was pretty punchy, actually. And I think that, I mean... the timing of it was sort of odd the way it all unfolded, because we had to wait for the Sue Gray report, and then the police investigation got in the way of the Sue Gray report, and Boris Johnson has always sort of said, well, we'll wait for this, and now the Sue Gray report's here, and actually I think it has sort of caught him, really. He is in this trap, and I think what John said at the beginning about how Tory MPs were really hoping that this would allow them to put it to bed, and it just hasn't. All the sort of detail that it's uncovered about cleaners and security staff being treated badly looks terrible, and you know, I really don't think this is the watered down version. This seems strong stuff.
Short answers, if I can ask both of you, Rachel.
Well, it's not just the question over the Sue Gray report. And she's a civil servant. She's got her own integrity to maintain, and I think she's done that and will continue to do that. Why would she tie her future to a failing Prime Minister and at this time? But I think there are questions to ask about the police, because if the security at Number 10 is what we expect it to be, surely people knew in live time exactly what was going on and why there wasn't an intervention at that point. They're the kind of questions that I think we need to get the answer to, because it seems that the police made a positive decision not to investigate when they would have observed these parties continuing at Number 10.
John?
I've met Sue Gray. You don't mess with Sue Gray. This is her report. Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's her report.
I had a few battles with her over publishing politicians' autobiographies, because she had to, well, not censor them, but sort of if there was anything sensitive in them. And she'd usually raise about 50 or 60 different points in the books, and I would probably agree to 2 of them. So we had a very interesting backwards and forwards. But you're right, you don't mess with Sue Gray.
Exactly.
Right, we'll come to more of your calls in a moment on Wednesday's Cross Question. It's 8:30, news headlines with Lottie Morley.
Boris Johnson says he won't resign following the release of Sue Gray's report into parties in Downing Street. The senior civil servant says the events should never have happened and senior leadership bear responsibility. It's emerged 21 people, including 19 children killed during a school shooting, were all barricaded in the same room. A lone gunman carried out the attack at Robb Elementary School in Uvalde in Texas. And British number 1 Cam Norrie is through to the 3rd round of the French Open with a straight set win over Australian Jason Kubler. Emma Raducanu has been knocked out. LBC weather, clear for many areas tonight. Rain edging into Northern Ireland, southwest Scotland, northwest England and Wales. A low of 6 degrees.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Text 84850.
It's 8:34 on LBC. You're listening to or watching Cross Question. John Penrose is here, former tourism minister. He now serves as the Prime Minister's anti-corruption champion. What does that involve? That must be quite a busy time for you at the moment.
It's actually
cheekily.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's actually a great deal less exciting than it sounds. There's a thing called the anti-corruption strategy. It's a 5-year thing, 130 odd action points right the way across government. And part of my job is to chase up and make sure that ministers are doing what they promised when they promised to do it. The other bit is trying to act as a sort of Jiminy Cricket sort of conscience on the shoulder of different ministers. So, for example, when it looked like the economic crime bill to try and deal with Russian oligarchs' money in the UK, it looked like that was going to slip away and not happen after all. So I and others were standing up in the House of Commons saying, you must be joking, we've got to do this, it's really important. At the time there were tanks on the border of Ukraine. So it's sort of looking upwind and saying, here's the right thing to do, can we find time to do it?
If it is indeed the fact that Boris Johnson asked Sue Gray not to publish her report, would you say that is borderline corruption?
So there's actually a slightly sort of nerdy technical definition of corruption, but it's about misuse of power, entrusted power, for your own personal benefit. So if he did, but we don't know he did, I hasten to add, but that would certainly qualify. But no one is being able to prove that at all, although I understand some people have asked the question. But no, that is, just for the benefit of your listeners, that is not a fact at all.
Rachael Maskell is here, Labour MP for York Central. Olivia Utley is Assistant Comment Editor at The Telegraph. And Pete Wishart is SNP MP for Perth and North Perthshire. And he's the party's shadow leader of the House. Do you say Perthshire or Shire?
Perthshire.
Shire, I thought you might.
Always Shire.
I sort of tried to obliquely sort of hide it, but didn't quite succeed. Right, next question is from John in Streatham. Hello, John.
Hello, Ian. Hello, panel. My simple question is to the MPs on the panel, and it's how the increase in energy costs will affect them, and do their expenses cover energy costs?
So can the panel explain how the increase in energy costs will affect them, and would their expenses cover the costs for MPs? Rachael?
Well, first of all, I don't claim expenses for anything but my travel, so I certainly wouldn't be affected on that front. I think that there's a realisation across MPs about the responsibility we've got to our constituents to ensure that they have money not just to scrape through and survive, but to have a life that through which they thrive. And that, to me, is the purpose of Parliament, the purpose of all of our jobs, and to make sure that the fiscal policies in place give not only protection but opportunity. And clearly that hasn't happened. And what we've seen is a regression of people moving into deeper levels of poverty. And I just witnessed that walking through my constituency, hearing people about the choices they're now making because the sums aren't adding up from the amount they're getting in to the amount they're having to pay out. And that is a really difficult time for people, because as much as we ask and call on ministers, to date we haven't had the relief that we want. We're hoping tomorrow the Chancellor's going to come forward and put Labour's windfall tax onto the oil and gas companies.
Labour's windfall tax. I see what you did there.
Well, I would have welcomed it had the Chancellor had such an initiative. And of course he should have put that in place at the start of the year when we started highlighting what was coming down the road. But things clearly have picked up a pace. What we don't want to see tomorrow, however, are just more sticking plasters being put over this gaping wound we've now got with inequality across our communities and society. And it's not just energy costs. I look at a place like York where housing costs, rental has gone up 10.2% over the last year. An average rental price now £945 a month. People are being pushed out of their accommodation. So we're talking about shelter as well as warmth, as well as food, which again is a massive issue. And with inflation at 9% and rising, people are going to struggle not just now, but it's going to escalate through the year. So we need proper fiscal measures to make a real difference to people's lives.
And what percentage of your constituents do you think are effectively suffering fuel poverty already? Because, I mean, I don't know York very well, but I think of it as quite a well-to-do area, but I suspect you're going to tell me that it's quite a significant proportion are being affected now.
Absolutely, and I always encourage people to look beyond the walls, because you don't have to get very far before you actually see some of the most deprived communities in the country where people really are struggling. And of course, if you've got this dual pattern of high cost of living and how high housing costs versus very low wages in York because of the hospitality and retail sector, we've got the perfect storm where people will struggle, and that's exactly what we're seeing. The in-work poverty, we don't have a big issue of unemployment, but clearly people who are working all of those hours, it's impacting on our economy, so also impacting on our public services as well, because people just can't afford to live in the city anymore. So we haven't got the care workers, NHS staff aren't able to continue their posts in the city. So this has big implications, and that's why I don't want to see just one or two little announcements to make the Chancellor feel good tomorrow or the Prime Minister to have a breathing space. I want to see a concerted effort and a strategy about how we're going to address inequality and poverty in our country.
Pete Wishart, address the question first about sort of how the energy costs affect you.
And they don't affect me at all. I mean, I'm on a salary of over £80,000 per year. The energy costs and the cost of living crisis that we're currently experiencing disproportionately hits people who are on low incomes, who are poor. And these are the people who, in my constituency, are absolutely suffering. The 1.5 million extra people who will now either be in fuel poverty or food poverty. And this has to be addressed properly. Now, I'm glad, and I'm not bothered about who takes the honours for bringing forward a windfall tax on energy companies, but it's the right thing to do. And the absurd profits that they're raking in just now out of this misery has to be addressed. And I think that the only way to do that is through windfall tax. That's convenient for this government because they're not going to have to do anything extra. They're not going to have to do anything like mucking around with the taxation regime in order to try and fund and pay for this. It's a very easy, simple and convenient things to do. And it's like to dig in the way that they have in the course of the past few weeks, I found actually quite strange and bewildering, given that Conservative governments have done this again and again. Margaret Thatcher did it. She did exactly the same thing with energy companies back in her day. And to string this along, because all it's done is just plunged even more people into poverty who will find it now harder to get out. And I'm fully expecting this will be announced tomorrow, and I would be surprised if they actually go further than what Labour were suggesting.
John Penrose, again, how does it affect you? But also, it's not just people at the bottom of the income range now, is it? It's Ed Balls was saying the other day, look, this is all about just about managings as well, people on relatively average earnings.
Yeah, lots of people will feel it. Some will feel it much more seriously than others. You're absolutely right, Ian. Just to address the central, the starting point of the question, I've no idea if the MP expenses scheme would theoretically allow any of us to claim energy bills,
because you're on a fixed
but I don't, and none of the three of us around this table do. So I can reassure your caller there. But I think the crucial thing here, and I would sort of gently disagree with Rachael about the fact we haven't done very much so far. I think we've done a great deal so far, but because, for example, we've cut the taper rate for universal credit, which means that people on the lowest incomes get to keep 8p more in the pound. That's the equivalent of a whopping great big tax cut than they were able to do before. And in a couple of weeks' time, the national insurance threshold will go up, which means that an awful lot of people who are currently paying national insurance won't have to pay it at all in future too. So big changes, but Rachael is right that because the energy prices are still going up, and they've kept on going up since Rishi last made a financial statement, a month and a half ago or something like that, we've got to do some more. It's not a static thing, it's a moving target. And so he's done a lot, and he's going to have to do more.
And is that a common belief on Conservative benches? Because there will be people who worry that any extra expenditure now is going to increase borrowing.
Yeah, and the problem which the Conservative Party faces is not that we don't accept that that this is a real big problem. It may not have been caused in the UK. It may have been caused by events in Ukraine and stuff like that. But we've got to fix it for our people insofar as we can. But the problem with it is that most of the answers either involve a lot more borrowing, or involve other things which will, in the long run, come back to bite not the Conservative Party necessarily, but the nation as a whole, taxpayers as a whole. So there aren't any easy answers. I hope that Rishi will look at going further on the sorts of things he's done already, but we'll have to wait and see tomorrow.
Olivia, I'm sure at the Telegraph you're only far more than MP does. So, does this affect you in any way?
Yeah, I mean, my husband and I earn about the same as an MP between us, and our gas bill's gone up, same as everyone else's, from £105 to £246 a month. That means we have a lot less in our pockets for us. That means we won't be going on a foreign holiday this year. That's obviously not the end of the world, but if you're a low or middle income earner, this is serious. This is, you can't buy the things that you would normally buy in your food shop. You can't enjoy life to the full, which seems very sad. That's something we don't talk about very much, which after what we've been through over the last 2.5 years, so sad to imagine families not being able to spend time together on a lovely summer holiday this year. And I think that, there'll be some more. The government is it gives with one hand and takes away with the other. The national insurance threshold's going up, but there's still this national insurance rise generally. And again, there doesn't really seem to be a plan for growth. There's no plan to make the UK is a good place for people to invest. There's no plan to help businesses grow. There's no plan to make it easier for employers to employ people. It's all about dividing up the pie that we've already got and tinkering around the edges there, which doesn't seem to be a particularly good pragmatic conservative philosophy, and I don't think will particularly attract any of these measures, will particularly fill the voters who voted Tory in 2019 with confidence.
Right, we will move on to a very different subject in a few moments' time. In fact, I'm going to give them advance notice of this question. Should any subject be off limits for comedians? Stay with us. It's 8:45.
LBC, Nick Ferrari at breakfast.
Environment, Food and Rural Affairs Secretary George Eustace. If more pictures were to emerge of the Prime Minister availing themselves of drink or giving toast to colleagues, how difficult would you find it to continue to defend him?
He himself, has expressed deep regret about what's happened. Sue Gray's run an independent inquiry to it, but obviously what we'll be looking at in Sue Gray's report is what recommendations she might make so that we can ensure this matter can really be put behind us and dealt with and changes made.
Nick Ferrari at breakfast. Back tomorrow morning from 7. Listen on your radio and on Global Player. LBC. Leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale. Tweet at LBC.
It's 8:48. John Penrose, Rachael Maskell, Olivia Utley and Pete Wishart here answering your questions. A text question from Laura in Putney. Should any subject be off limits for comedians? Now, I think the hook for this is the fact that Ricky Gervais has defended making jokes about taboo subjects after his new Netflix special drew, shall we say, quite a lot of criticism. In Supernature, he makes a string of what he describes as ironic and satirical jokes about trans people, female comedians and AIDS. I think this is a really difficult one, because if you justify that, Pete Wishart, you could, in theory, justify making jokes about gay people, black people, Jewish people. I mean, each one of us on this panel is going to have a different line to draw, aren't we?
I mean, people could have jokes about anything they want, but I watched the piece that I think you're referring to, and I was very uncomfortable with it. I didn't like it. And I'm somebody who's a huge fan of Ricky Gervais. I loved The Office, I loved Afterlife. I think they're fantastic programmes. But it's so easy to go for the most vulnerable, to go for the most marginal, to go for the least supported. If he's talking about trans people, you know, like, they have real massive difficulties in terms of being probably the most marginal community we have within our society just now. If you wanted to be a big, brave comic, go for the people who have the power. Like, make jokes to power, but to pick on a community like the trans community, the way that he did, in such an appalling way. I mean, like, there's an equivalence with things about rape and toilets, all the usual subjects that a lot of the transphobes in this debate start to delve into, and I just did not like it. I thought he let himself down really badly. It's his right to do that, but I think people in a position like Ricky Gervais have got to think seriously just about the impact that this has on all the rest of the people, particularly the community that he's having a go at.
Are we not going to end up, if we're not careful, in a situation where you literally can't make a joke about anything? Like, national stereotypes are sort of just, people frown on those nowadays. Sexual stereotypes. I mean, it's quite a difficult one, isn't it?
You and I, Iain, are of a generation, and we grew up watching TV like Love Thy Neighbour. You would never put a TV show because your judgment wouldn't allow that to happen. You would think that there is something which is awkward and which jars about the type of jokes that we
Mind your
watch.
language, remember that?
Absolutely. And I remember all these things. So, like, nobody's going to censor or ban anybody. But if you're in a position like Ricky Gervais, a very privileged position where people love the work that you do and, like, admire you, you've got to be very careful about all this. I think he got that badly wrong, and I think a whole community is hurting because of the things he said about them.
Rachael?
I haven't seen the piece, but anything that denigrates somebody or a community clearly is completely off limits and inappropriate, and therefore I cannot support somebody that propagates that tension in the community, but also to kind of drive into somebody's identity. And as Peter said, you know, this is a community which is trying to find an identity in society at the moment, and to then have that knocked back even further.
But he justifies it by saying, he says it's mad to think that joking about something means you're anti it. Well, there is a point to that, isn't there?
Well, no, I couldn't disagree more with him, because ultimately you're talking about somebody's personal identity, which, you know, we know within the trans community, really trying to establish almost a right to exist in our society, and then to be pushed and marginalised out of the way, to be made fun of and being subject to somebody's humour, that is completely inappropriate in our society. And I would say, you know, the fact that people feel they've got the liberty to even make those kind of jokes, because today it's about a trans person, who is it about tomorrow? And obviously that builds tension in our communities as well. We've got to support people who are particularly vulnerable, and to ensure that people are embraced and feel that they've got a place in our society. There is no space for him.
John?
I think we've got to be careful as politicians not to try and hold comedians to the same standards which we expect from ourselves. I mean, if any of us were to try and make those kinds of comments and mean them seriously, then, you know, Rachel, I'm completely with you. That
but he's saying he doesn't mean them seriously. It's a joke.
Well, so precisely. So that's why I'm saying that as politicians, we shouldn't be equating ourselves with comedians or comedians with us. I think there's a really, you know, simple and sometimes a little bit brutal standard which needs to apply to politicians, to comedians, which is, do they make people laugh? And if they get it wrong because they have misjudged where society is today, and they make a joke about a subject which everyone turns around and says, do you know what, that's just not funny, then they failed as a comedian, and that's the wrong thing to have done. But if they get everyone in peals of laughter, and you can make people laugh about really difficult subjects, things which no politician would ever dare go anywhere near, and you can actually...
apart from microfabricant, obviously.
Well, perhaps not. But the crucial question is that that they have a different standard, and if they get that standard wrong and they don't make people laugh, then they've failed, and it's different from the sorts of standards which we as politicians ought to be holding ourselves to.
Olivia?
Well, I think it all comes down to the definition of off limits. I agree with John, basically, that we've got to have some sort of free speech in this country. And should a comedian, be banned from making particular jokes before they go on air? Banned by who? Who's making that decision? Is that the government? Isn't that... Why should the government get to say? Who is doing the banning here?
It's actually the audience that polices these things, isn't it, in a way?
Exactly. That if the audience doesn't find it funny, and if there are lots of people complaining into Netflix, then Netflix probably, won't want to do a second run of his show, or they'll tell him that the audience isn't liking it and he should tone down the offensive humour, and he will. And I think these things are sort of self-correcting in the long run. But the idea of anyone, particularly the government, we've seen this government's in a shambles. If it gets a say over what comedians are allowed to say in their comedy shows, then I think that would be a nightmare and a bad path to go down.
I'd quite like to be the comedy regulator.
The Minister for Humour.
Could be called Ofcom, couldn't it? Oh, no, we've got one of those. Right. Thank you very much, Laura. Let's go to David in Chipping Campden. Hello, David.
Hello, Ian. How are you?
Hi, very well, thank you. What would you like to ask?
Basically, just to quote Thomas Jefferson, the government you elect is the government you deserve. Would the panel agree, therefore, that our society is shambolic at the moment?
Well, it's a great question. You've literally got 1 minute each to answer this very, very difficult question. John?
No, I wouldn't agree with the central premise of the question. But democracy is the right to choose whoever you want, and I think that what we've got to do is to live up to the reasons why people voted Conservative in 2019 about levelling up. We've got to deliver on that, and if we don't do it, then people will judge us very badly indeed.
And do you think you are living up to that?
Actually, based on what was in the Queen's speech, the list of bills about levelling up, yes, I do. I would respectfully disagree with Olivia's points about she thinks there's a vacuum. I don't. But we've got to get it done, and we've got to get it done fast.
Pete?
Well, I'm in the invidious situation that my nation didn't vote for this government. In fact, we overwhelmingly rejected them, but they're still imposed upon. It's a situation that I'm working round the clock to rectify, Ian.
We are still one United Kingdom.
We are indeed one United Kingdom, and that's something I'm trying to resolve for the betterment of my nation, so that we aren't governed by people that we didn't vote for, who are making our country miserable and having the worst possible form of governance, particularly a day after today, and this is what Scotland is still having to endure, and I can't wait until we're away from it.
Olivia?
No, I wouldn't say it's society's fault that the government's in a mess. I think we got ourselves into some pretty sticky patches over lockdown and all shouting at each other all the time. But I'm hoping that we're heading towards a better era, and I'm hoping that the government can pull up its socks and, as John says, do right by the people that elected it.
Rachael?
Well, when you've got a fixed electoral system, then you may not get the government of your choice. And if you look, first past the post will deliver a certain outcome. And we've got to move democracy forward now and look at PR, the opportunities that has to actually hear what the country actually wants.
It's not Labour Party policy, is it?
Not yet, but it will be coming, because we've got to have an electoral system which actually reflects what the people of our country wants. And clearly, first past the post is fixed on a certain number of seats. You can't win on the system
that's done us quite well for 200 years, so you want to fiddle the system so the Labour Party can win with others?
No, I want the voice of the population to be heard in Westminster, and that isn't represented at the moment. And we know that the electoral system is fixed around a small number of seats, which parties scrap over, as opposed to trying to win the consensus of the country, and that's what's got to move forward.
OK, we could debate that for a long time, but we're going to go to our final fun text question from Peter in Barnes. A full English breakfast apparently costs 40p more this year than last year. Which bit of a fry-up should be dropped to save money, and which should always remain? Partial to a fry-up, Pete?
Absolutely. I mean, I find that question outrageous. Asking us to forgo one piece. And I'm quite happy to call it full English, and I enjoy the very fine breakfast we get in the House of Commons, and to think that we'd have to go... I mean, if maybe the veggie sausage, if one came, or, I don't know.
With you there.
Yeah.
And which bit do you actually look forward to eating most?
Black pudding. And in Scotland, we have haggis.
Disgusting.
With
Even more
breakfast
disgusting.
too. So, these are the things that I think all of us enjoy, a healthy fry-up, and to think that we should forgo something, because of cost of living.
Healthy fry-up, does that actually match? I'm not sure it does. Olivia?
I drop the beans. I don't like the way they leak all their juice over everything else. But I'm with Pete on the black pudding, definitely. Yeah.
Oh dear. Rachel?
I think there needs to be a switch over to cereal by the sounds of it, because clearly this is a healthy option that I haven't discovered in the full English breakfast. But I think it's really important people keep their egg, because that's probably the wholesome bit of the breakfast.
And how do you like your eggs?
I like them poached.
John?
So I'm a huge fan of the full English, or if Pete wants it, the full Scottish. I don't care. But look, if I had to lose one thing, I guess it would be the beans. Not because I don't like beans, but because I don't like the way beans and eggs go together. So I'd keep the egg rather than the beans. And the bit that's best is the bacon, by miles.
Well, I feel we've learnt a lot from this question, maybe more than from any of the others on the programme. I don't know. We'll leave the audience to judge that. Thank you very much indeed to John Penrose, Rachael Maskell, Olivia Utley and Pete Wishart. Cross Question will be back on Monday at 8 o'clock. Coming up tomorrow, though, we have Mick Lynch, the head of the RMT. He's going to be spending an hour in the studio with me, answering for why the RMT are calling a national strike, and he's going to answer your questions as well. And then at 9 o'clock tomorrow, we have Sylvie Berman, who was the French ambassador to the UK during Brexit. She's written a book about her experience, which I'm going to be reading tomorrow, and I think I'm going to find it quite uncomfortable reading in a way. So we've got a great programme lined up for you tomorrow. And in the next hour, we're going to take more of your calls on the Sue Gray report, get more of your reaction. 0345 6060 973. We've cleared the switchboard, so if you called earlier and didn't get on, I'm afraid you will have to call again. 0345 6060 973. It's 9 o'clock.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 9 o'clock.